Think about the way you handle conflict. The way you respond to criticism. The way you pursue, or avoid, intimacy. The way you relate to authority. The way you feel about your own body, your own needs, your own worth. Now ask yourself, when did you learn all of that? Not consciously. Not from a book or a classroom. But in the years before you had language sophisticated enough to question what you were absorbing. In the years when the adults around you were your entire world, and everything they did, everything they withheld, everything they demanded, left its mark. Freud made a claim that shocked the world and has never quite stopped being controversial. The personality you carry as an adult was largely formed in the first 6 years of your life. And not just formed, fixed. Shaped by experiences so early that you cannot consciously remember most of them. Driven by conflicts so fundamental that you have been managing their aftermath ever since. Today we are going deep into Freud's theory of psychosexual development, one of the most misunderstood, most dismissed, and most psychologically illuminating frameworks ever proposed. Not because every detail is correct, but because the core insight it contains may explain more about who you are than anything else you have ever encountered. Before we enter the stages themselves, we need to understand the foundation Freud was building on. He proposed that the human psyche is not born neutral. It arrives in the world already driven by what he called the libido, a broad life energy, a drive toward pleasure, connection, and aliveness that is not merely sexual in the narrow sense but encompasses the entire spectrum of human desire and vitality. This libido, Freud argued, does not flow freely and evenly through life. It moves through specific developmental stages, each centered on a different zone of the body and a different psychological conflict. And at each stage, something critical can go wrong. If a child's needs at a given stage are not adequately met, if they experience too much frustration or, equally, too much indulgence, the libido becomes fixated at that stage. It gets stuck. A portion of the psyche's energy remains anchored to that unresolved conflict, even as the body and the conscious mind move forward into adulthood. And the consequence of that fixation is not merely childhood difficulty. It is adult personality. Adult behavior. Adult relationship patterns. Adult sources of anxiety, control, shame, and compulsion. This is the central claim: the battles of your earliest years are still being fought. You are just fighting them in disguise, in your career, your relationships, your habits, your fears, in every domain where you cannot quite explain why you respond the way you do. The first stage Freud identified runs from birth to approximately 18 months. He called it the oral stage because the infant's primary mode of experiencing the world, of receiving pleasure, comfort, and connection, is through the mouth. Feeding is not merely nutrition at this stage. It is the infant's first experience of need, of dependency, of whether the world is a place that responds to them. Whether comfort arrives. Whether the source of nourishment is reliable or unpredictable. The psychological conflict of the oral stage is fundamentally about trust and dependency. Does the world respond when I need it? Can I depend on others to meet my needs? Is receiving something I am allowed to do? When this stage is navigated well, when feeding is consistent, responsive, and warm, the child develops a basic sense of trust. A foundation of security that will support every subsequent developmental challenge. But when it goes wrong, when feeding is unreliable, when the primary caregiver is absent or inconsistent, when the child's needs are systematically unmet or overwhelmed, fixation occurs. Freud identified 2 oral character types that emerge from fixation at this stage. The oral dependent personality, someone who carries an unresolved hunger into adulthood. Who seeks constant reassurance and approval. Who may struggle with dependency in relationships, with addictive behaviors, with a persistent sense of emptiness that no amount of external comfort quite fills. The oral aggressive personality, someone who responded to early frustration with hostility. Who tends toward sarcasm, criticism, and verbal aggression. Who uses words as weapons in ways that feel compulsive rather than chosen. You may recognize elements of both in yourself, or in people you know. The point is not to label, it is to see that what looks like personality may be the echo of a very early conflict that was never resolved. Between approximately 18 months and 3 years, the child enters what Freud called the anal stage, a period dominated by the developing capacity for control. For the first time, the child has something the adult world wants from them, the ability to comply or to refuse. Toilet training becomes, in Freud's framework, the arena where the first major battle between the child's autonomy and external authority is played out. The psychological conflict here is about control, autonomy, and compliance. Who has power over my body, my impulses, my behavior? What happens when I comply? What happens when I refuse? When this stage is navigated well, with patience, appropriate expectations, and respect for the child's developing sense of self, the child internalizes a healthy relationship with authority. They learn that compliance and autonomy can coexist. That rules have a logic. That self-control is a capacity rather than a punishment. But when this stage produces fixation, through either excessive strictness or excessive permissiveness, the character consequences are significant. The anal retentive personality, someone who responds to early experiences of harsh control with rigidity, perfectionism, and an excessive need for order. Someone for whom control is not a tool but a compulsion. Someone who finds genuine discomfort in ambiguity, mess, or situations they cannot manage. The anal expulsive personality, someone who responded to early control with rebellion. Who tends toward disorganization, impulsivity, and a chronic difficulty with authority. Who experiences rules as attacks on the self rather than structures that support life. Again, not a diagnosis. A map. A way of tracing present compulsions back to their developmental origin. Between approximately 3 and 6 years, the child enters the stage Freud considered the most psychologically consequential of all, the phallic stage. This is the period during which the child becomes aware of anatomical differences, begins to develop a sense of gendered identity, and encounters, in Freud's framework, the most complex psychological drama of early life, the Oedipus complex. Freud observed that children at this stage develop intense feelings of attachment toward the opposite-sex parent and a corresponding rivalry or anxiety in relation to the same-sex parent. The child wants exclusive possession of one parent and fears the consequences of that desire from the other. He called this the Oedipus complex, after the Greek myth of Oedipus, who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, and argued that it is not a pathology but a universal developmental experience that every child must navigate. The resolution of the Oedipus complex is, in Freud's framework, the single most important developmental achievement of childhood. It is the moment when the child relinquishes the fantasy of possessing the desired parent, identifies with the same-sex parent instead, and internalizes the moral authority of the family, forming what Freud called the superego. When this complex is resolved well, the child develops a stable gender identity, a healthy relationship with authority and morality, and the psychological foundation for mature adult relationships. When it is not resolved, when the rivalry produces too much anxiety, when the identification with the same-sex parent is too fraught, when the family dynamics make navigation impossible, the consequences ripple through every subsequent romantic and authority relationship the person will ever have. The person who cannot commit. Who is always competing. Who relates to every authority figure as either an idealized parent or a feared rival. Who chooses partners unconsciously based on the unresolved Oedipal dynamic rather than genuine adult compatibility. Between approximately 6 years and puberty, the child enters what Freud called the latency stage, a period of relative psychological calm after the storm of the phallic stage. The intense desires and conflicts of the earlier stages are not resolved, they are repressed. Pushed underground. The libidinal energy that was previously focused on these psychosexual conflicts is redirected, sublimated, into the pursuits of childhood, learning, play, friendship, skill development, social integration. This is the period when the child is building the social and intellectual capacities that will carry them into adult life. The conflicts are not gone. They are dormant. Freud considered this stage less critically formative than the earlier ones, not because what happens here is unimportant, but because the major psychological structures have already been laid down. The latency stage is the period during which the child consolidates what has already been formed. The quality of peer relationships at this stage, the experience of school and social belonging, the first encounters with larger social structures and their demands, all of these leave their mark. But they are building on a foundation already set. With puberty, the latency ends and the final stage begins, the genital stage. The repressed conflicts of the earlier stages resurface, now filtered through the body of an adolescent and then an adult. Freud argued that the goal of the genital stage is the integration of everything that came before. The resolution of whatever oral, anal, and phallic fixations remain. The development of the capacity for genuine adult intimacy, relationships that are not primarily driven by the unconscious repetition of old wounds, but by mutual recognition, desire, and care. In practice, this integration is never perfect. Every adult carries some portion of unresolved earlier stage material. The question is not whether you have fixations, you do, because everyone does, but how much of your psychic energy they claim. How loudly the old conflicts speak beneath the surface of your adult life. The person who reaches the genital stage with relatively resolved earlier conflicts has access to the full range of their psychological energy. They can love and work, Freud's famous formulation of psychological health, without being constantly derailed by the unconscious management of unresolved childhood material. The person who arrives at adulthood with significant unresolved fixations finds that much of their energy is claimed by the past. Not consciously, but in the patterns that repeat. In the reactions that feel disproportionate. In the needs that can never quite be filled. In the relationships that somehow always recreate the same dynamic they were trying to escape. Let's make this concrete. Oral fixation in adult life looks like chronic reassurance-seeking, difficulty being alone, addictive relationships with substances, food, or validation, a persistent low-grade emptiness that external comfort temporarily soothes but never resolves. The sense that you are always waiting for someone to finally give you what you need. Anal fixation in adult life looks like an excessive need for control that damages relationships. Perfectionism that prevents completion. Chronic procrastination as a form of withholding. Power struggles in every significant relationship. The inability to delegate, to let go, to tolerate mess or ambiguity. Phallic fixation in adult life looks like chronic competitiveness. Difficulty with authority. Relationship patterns that unconsciously recreate the Oedipal triangle, the unavailable partner, the rival, the fantasy of finally winning the love that was once out of reach. A sexuality that is entangled with power, conquest, or shame rather than genuine intimacy. None of these are permanent sentences. They are descriptions of where the psyche got stuck, and descriptions, by their nature, the beginning of the possibility of change. Freud's developmental theory was not designed to make you feel determined by your past. It was designed to make the past visible, because visibility is the precondition of freedom. The work, as always in Freud's framework, is to make the unconscious conscious. To look at the patterns of your adult life and ask honestly, where does this come from? What early conflict is this behavior still managing? What need was formed so long ago that I have been trying to meet it in every wrong place ever since? This is not comfortable work. Looking clearly at the ways your earliest experiences shaped you, without either idealizing your caregivers or simply blaming them, requires a particular kind of honesty that most people spend their lives avoiding. But here is what Freud understood, and what every serious depth psychologist since has confirmed: the past does not have less power over you because you refuse to look at it. It has more. The childhood that shaped you does not need your permission to go on shaping you. It is already doing so, in every reaction that feels out of proportion, in every relationship that recreates a dynamic you swore you'd left behind, in every pattern you have tried to change through willpower alone and found you could not. The question is not whether your childhood is still controlling you. It almost certainly is. The question is whether you are willing to look clearly enough to begin choosing differently. If you found yourself in any of these stages, if you recognized the oral hunger, the anal rigidity, the phallic competition, the unresolved longing, that recognition is not a verdict. It is an invitation. An invitation to understand yourself with more compassion and more clarity than you have before. To see that what you thought were flaws of character are often the entirely logical consequences of experiences you had before you had any choice in the matter. You didn't choose your earliest environment. You didn't choose what was withheld or what was demanded. You only chose, as every child chooses, the best available adaptation. The adult work is to examine that adaptation. To decide what still serves you and what it is finally time to put down. Like this video if it gave you something to think about. Leave a comment with which stage resonated most. And subscribe, because this channel exists for exactly this kind of work. I'll see you in the next one.